For too long, higher education has been structured according to disciplines. That is, pockets of knowledge segregated from each other and then codified and taught exclusively. The trouble is, traditional degree subjects don't map very well onto real-world problems. So there is a disconnect between a discipline, which is rigidly defined and taught, and an actual societal problem, which is complex and multidimensional. So the approach needed to understand and tackle such problems must be interdisciplinary. That means it must bring together knowledge from different disciplines in new and unique ways. The London Interdisciplinary School was founded for exactly this purpose, and in this next session, its academics will show us just how powerful interdisciplinarity can be as an approach to research as well as learning.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us here at the 2021 Polymath Festival, curated so brilliantly by the DaVinci network. I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen so far and also what you have heard. My name is Nizam Uddin and I will be your moderator and facilitator for this evening session, certainly in London, entitled The Power of Interdisciplinarity. We see firsthand today what leaders in politics, in business, in academia are having to contend with to try and solve this multidimensional problem and complexity that we see in each of our everyday lives in the COVID-19 pandemic. Personally, through my own work, sitting on a number of COVID response structures, including on a subcommittee of SAGE in the UK, I see firsthand the conflicting nature of decision-making that is playing out. So our plan today for our session is actually quite simple, which is to interrogate and express the power of interdisciplinarity in our everyday lives to solve complex problems. It is obviously at the heart of a polymathic approach and something everybody I hope will agree with in our session today. So what do we mean by interdisciplinarity? Well, I am glad I just asked that question to myself, because today we have an exceptional lineup to look at this through the complex phenomenon of happiness. You heard that right. Happiness is something that we all strive for, but what do we actually mean by that? I'm really delighted that we have colleagues here from the London Interdisciplinary School, London's newest university, who are in the business of creating graduates that are more rounded to solve very complex problems. I am thrilled to invite first Professor Carl Gombrich to set the framework for interdisciplinarity. Carl is a British interdisciplinary educator, academic, opera singer, and co-founder of the London Interdisciplinary School. He was a professorial teaching fellow of interdisciplinary education at UCL and is a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Carl has degrees in maths, physics, and philosophy, and was a professional opera singer before joining University College London. So, Carl, over to you to set the tone.
Thank you, Nizam. Thank you very much, and for that very relevant introduction. Yes, I'm only going to speak for 4 minutes to pass over to my learned colleagues for some detail on this complex problem of happiness that we've chosen to illustrate really this approach of interdisciplinary thinking, learning, and research. And as Nizam has intimated, you know, we live in this world now where these so-called complex real-world problems are everywhere. We see them, whether it's in climate change or talking about sustainability in the environment. We see them talking about any human systems, for example, the sort of COVID problems which Nizam has mentioned. And all these complex problems have these interacting parts and require this kind of multiple perspective approach in order to get a grasp of the problem. And really the only way one can hope to do that is through some kind of interdisciplinary approach. Now, many viewers, I think, will know that this is not the way we're educated. We're educated in academic subjects, and so our education isn't very well matched to understanding these so-called complex real-world problems. And the challenge for us, and it really is a challenge, interdisciplinarity is hard. We don't shy away from that. But the challenge for us is to try to educate ourselves and others so that we can tackle these interdisciplinary problems better. Just want to briefly mention the connection between interdisciplinarity and polymathy. Polymathy, of course, resides kind of in one individual. It's a way an individual has of approaching their own learning. And interdisciplinarity can happen between teams of people as well, not just in one individual. But there's a kind of spectrum there which we need to acknowledge and work with which is distinct from what you might call monodisciplinarity or more siloed learning, which is the way we think about our education, our knowledge structures, and so on. So interdisciplinarity is hard. It's cognitively hard. It's very hard to be good at more than one thing, as polymaths will know. It's theoretically hard. I've kind of hinted already at that, and in another context, we could explore the very deep theoretical challenges of understanding what it really even means to be interdisciplinary, and perhaps we'll go there a bit later on today. And it's even emotionally hard. There are academics who've written on the emotional challenges of being interdisciplinary, because academics particularly have to give up their worldview, which is very often centered on and based around their disciplinary training. And it can be emotionally challenging to move from a more scientific position to a more humanistic position, to an artistic position, and vice versa. But just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. On the contrary, we like hard things. They are challenging, as a more positive mindset might put it. It's not a negative thing to be hard. And I think really the honest stance on interdisciplinarity is that it's a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for tackling these real world problems. In other words, if you don't have an interdisciplinary approach, it's going to be insufficient for many of these real world problems. But of course, people always want the sufficiency. They always want to say, yeah, is this definitely going to work? Well, we can't really promise that, but we can promise that you're highly unlikely or much less likely to get a positive way of interacting with and changing and moving these complex systems. You're much less likely to do it unless you take an interdisciplinary approach. So that's, if you like, the promise. It's a gamble, but it's a gamble we have to take, because to do anything less is going much less likely to lead to positive outcomes. So that's our approach. We bravely go forth, knowing that interdisciplinarity is hard, but believing it's the only way or the best possible way to give us some chances of success in these complex real world problems. And the problem we've chosen today to look at, because we're doing it within our institution, is this problem of happiness and how we might understand that from many disciplinary perspectives. So that's my brief introduction, and happy to pass back to you now, Nizam.
Carl, thank you very much. And one immediate challenge that I will pose to you to think about is, how do you deal with the inadequacy I feel in hearing you speak about polymathy and the fact that I can't ever do enough. But up next, I am delighted to invite Dr. Mattia Galotti, who is an academic philosopher with a background in the social sciences. After reading economics and philosophy at Bocconi University and the London School of Economics, Mattia completed a PhD at the University of Exeter. Before joining LIS, Mattia lectured on the philosophy of the social sciences at the LSE and led on the academic management of the Human Mind project. And as we are interrogating this complex notion of happiness, I invite Mattia to come and give us a philosophical breakdown of how we can approach it. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Nizam. And let me just say, I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. So thanks so much for having me on this panel. So as Nizam just said, I'm a philosopher by training. I wasn't born a philosopher, intellectually speaking. So I did study economics first, and then I worked with cognitive scientists. So I sort of come, as you might expect of someone teaching at LIS, I myself have a bit of an interdisciplinary background. And so when I started to work on happiness with my colleagues, I guess my thinking was guided by a couple of ideas, really. One is about the meaning of interdisciplinarity, what interdisciplinary means, how it works in practice. And then the other idea was about the role of philosophy in interdisciplinary education. So I'm going to say a few things about my theory of interdisciplinarity. I'm sure our listeners tonight will be familiar with things like the wisdom of crowds and the idea that sometimes groups of people are smarter than the individuals that comprise them. Now, we call this phenomena phenomenal forms of collective intelligence. Why is that? What does that mean? Well, it means that when we bring things together into a system, sometimes the system behaves differently from the behavior of the single parts. And I like to think of interdisciplinarity a bit like in the same way, as a form of collective intelligence. Why is that? Because when we bring together subjects, different subjects and disciplines, the combination very likely creates some new knowledge. So it brings about knowledge that wasn't there before, knowledge that we now want to call truly interdisciplinary. So I'd like to invite all our listeners to think about interdisciplinarity really as a form of collective intelligence. I can tell you that's fun, also theoretically. Now, how about philosophy? Well, again, back to the problem of happiness, really. We thought that happiness lends itself naturally to interdisciplinary lenses. Why is that? Because happiness is not really one-dimensional. If we now think that happiness is one-dimensional, well, this is very relative, and it's a product of our times. We now think that happiness always comes as a positive thing, as a plus. Think about all the happy emojis we have on our phone. Be happy is the mantra of our time. But it's not always been the case. In fact, actually, for a very long time, since Aristotle until possibly a couple of centuries ago, unhappy thoughts, unhappy feelings were actually taken to be the signal of great minds, of bright minds. While nowadays, unhappiness literally means lack of happiness. And so we are used now to think about unhappiness as something that comes with a negative connotation. What I'm saying is that there is a sharp divide in our culture between what we take to be happiness and what we take to be unhappiness. Someone like the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard used to think that unhappiness, and especially melancholia, was a fantastic source of creativity, actually, and the source of spiritual blessing. It's always nice to remind ourselves of the meaning of melancholia. Melancholia comes from the Greek melanchole, which means black bile, so something not very good. And yet, for a very long time, great thinkers thought that melancholia was a trait of bright minds. So this is what I've tried to do. I've tried to bring different dimensions to the table in order to problematize the idea that we now have of happiness. And I believe that when we bring these dimensions to the table, again, the combination will generate a more nuanced and truly interdisciplinary understanding of happiness. Some people, many of us, live happily unhappy lives. So here we go. We have an interdisciplinary definition of happiness.
Mattia, thank you. The idea of living happily an unhappy life is such a fascinating concept to mull over. I want to encourage those who are joining us. Thank you for joining us this evening, if you're in London or wherever you are in the world. If you have thoughts, musings, immediate responses to what you've heard so far, please do share them with us in the chat function. And especially if you have questions, we're going to have a couple of more speakers and then we're going to go and put your questions to our guests. So please do feel free to put them on there. Up next, we have Dr. Amelia Peterson. Amelia is a social scientist with a background in policy and consulting. Amelia studies education reforms and their relationship to social, geographic, and labour markets inequalities. Prior to joining LIS, Amelia was an LSE Fellow in Social Policy and has also taught and supervised students at the University of Bristol and also at Harvard, where she received her PhD. Amelia, thank you for joining us, and over to you to hear your perspective on happiness.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, so really just continuing on from where Mattia left off. So we have this idea that happiness, once we start to think about it, once we start to problematize it, isn't necessarily just one thing. But from where I come from in the kind of public policy world, we've thought about happiness as a potential kind of policy goal. So it's become something that's been championed along with the sort of broader goal of well-being as perhaps an alternative to growth, to GDP, something that we might really all focus on at a kind of national level. But when we come from that perspective, suddenly there's a demand for kind of really simple, straightforward measures of what is happiness. How do we know which countries are the happiest? How do we know which parts of a country are suffering from a lack of happiness? And so while we might be able to appreciate this kind of deeply problematized perspective, we've got this demand for simple measures. And we really can't kind of rectify, we can't bridge that gap unless we can fully understand and appreciate both of those perspectives. So if we go the route of just saying, okay, we'll sort of just focus on this kind of public policy perspective, let's use what we know about measurement, we end up with some of the surveys that exist already, where we're asking really quite simple questions about kind of life satisfaction, for example, and we can create happiness metrics from those. But what we've seen is, although a number of these metrics exist, we have a well-being dashboard in the UK. You can go and look it up. The ONS is producing data on it all the time based on the way people answer questions about their happiness. But they don't seem to necessarily get kind of political traction. And I think this is partly because actually the philosophers are right. And we all have this deep sense that happiness isn't this kind of simple thing. It's not something that you can capture by just answering a question about it. And I think that's why some of our kind of attempts to make it a policy issue haven't necessarily been successful, because we haven't fully incorporated the insights of philosophy for one, but also really the full understanding of happiness as an emotion from a more kind of physiological perspective. So others of our colleagues who come at this, from biochemistry, thinking about biochemistry aspect of this, who come at this more from psychology, thinking about really in a rich sense, sort of what are these emotions meant in an evolutionary way? Why do we have these different kinds of emotions? And what's the wider range of emotions and the role they play in our lives? They bring a very different perspective to how should we think about kind of the emotional states that we have beyond just something that could be kind of a policy goal. So it's really my view on this now that, if we want to further the kind of well-being movement, if we want to place our interior lives, our kind of mental health more at the center of policy, we need to have a richer perspective of what those mental experiences, those interior experiences actually are. And that's going to really demand looking beyond our kind of standard approach to measurement.
Amelia, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating, especially the juxtaposition, like you say, as somebody who also works in policy, very much at the heart of implementing policy, those interior experiences and often the tension that we have at the heart of government to try and create quite simplistic proxies, which are often more political in nature than about resolving the problem. So thank you so much, and I can't wait to interrogate that a bit further. Up next, we have Dr. James Carney, who before joining LIS, James worked in various academic positions across the UK and Ireland. He is currently concluding an appointment as a Wellcome Trust Fellow at Brunel University, London, where he has used methods from machine learning and experimental psychology to establish the therapeutic impact of friction on anxiety and depression. James, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Nizam. So yeah, you've characterized my background there in a quantitative sense. And what I typically like to do in my research and in my teaching is to leverage the powers of computational methods to investigate the cultural record in different ways. Now, bringing that to bear on the problem of happiness, what emerges quite quickly is that though we tend to think of happiness as a concrete experience, as an emotion that we inhabit in physiological and very direct ways in which we see in other people's faces. And of course, we do all of that. The fact is that as a species, one of the most idiosyncratic characteristics that human beings have is that we mediate ourselves through culture. And many of our emotions aren't necessarily given to us through those direct methods of perception, but they come to us symbolically, they come to us linguistically, they come to us through images. And therefore, if we wish to get a measure of an emotion like happiness, or indeed any other emotion, what we need to do is, or one of the things at least that we need to do, and this goes back to some of what Amelia was saying there, is we need to develop very sophisticated metrics of how it is that we can gain purchase upon these emotions in ways that are quantifiably usable, but also theoretically rigorous and also usable in the various different practical ways that we want to use them. So much of what I do is centered on that ambition. Now I'm going to do something here which perhaps is not optimal, but I want to just show some very quick quantitative illustrations of what that is in terms of what I do and the kind of work that I do. So let me just get the slide. So yeah. No, it doesn't seem to want to. Oh, here we go. So one of the key questions that that my research wishes to look at is how we gain traction upon these emotions. Now, the difficulty is that when you look at the repertoire of human emotions, they're very, very complicated. When you start off from the inner circle there of the kind of the 7 basic emotions, they kind of exfoliate into a much wider and deeper set of possible emotions that human beings can experience. So if you want to get a linguistic measure of how happiness is expressed linguistically, you're stuck with a big problem, which is that happiness is consistent with playful, content, interested, proud, accepted, all of which go out further again too. So if you wish to see how a word embodies happiness, you have to capture all of this emotional variation, which is basically unfeasible to do on empirical grounds alone. Because how could you ask enough people to get enough ratings in all of these emotions in any kind of feasible time? So one of these solutions that was proposed to this some time back was what's known as a dimensional model of emotion. And this dimensional model of emotion suggests that you can break any emotion down into 3 fundamental components. One of which is valence, which is how pleasant or unpleasant an emotion is. Another one of which is arousal, which is how energizing or sedating an emotion is, how much it kind of makes you jittery and wide awake, how much it puts you to sleep. And the third component then is dominance, which is how in control or controlled an emotion makes you feel. And the idea is that if you can get emotions rated on each of these 3 dimensions, you get a very good taxonomy that allows you to characterize exactly where any one emotion sits in the space of possible human emotions. And some of the work that I've done in the past and some of the work that other people working in linguistics have done in the past is getting people to rate words and rate emotions for where they sit in this particular taxonomy of underlying components. And just to give an example of what that looks like in practice, you can see here some common human emotions represented in terms of their 3 underlying dimensions. You have valence going on one scale, you have arousal on the other, and on the right-hand side, you have dominance. And as you can see, happiness sits in a very interesting position there relative to the other repertoire of human emotions. You have sadness going on the far side, you have depression, anxiety, and loneliness in one kind of cluster. Then you have anger, hate, rage, which are kind of highly energized emotions in another cluster. And then in the middle, you have sorry, thoughtful, attentive, which are kind of cognitive emotions, which allow you to kind of think or focus on thinking processes. But you have happiness, excitement, euphoria, and arousal up in the top right back corner there. So what this gives you, this particular model, this valence, arousal, dominance model of emotion gives you, is a way of classifying how it is that emotions sit in this 3-dimensional space of possible human emotions. Where that becomes maybe more useful when you're looking to characterize how happiness gets expressed linguistically is you can take any linguistic stimulus, have it rated for valence, arousal, or dominance, and you can then see where that stimulus or that concept sits in this 3-dimensional space of emotional variation. So one consequence of doing that is, I'll come back to that, is these 200 words here. So these are 200 random English words which are rated for valence, arousal, and dominance. And you can see that they allow you to kind of capture emotional variation in language in that same 3-dimensional space that you capture standard variation in emotions. And this gives us a way of capturing this big scale, cultural, linguistic, symbolic expression of different kinds of emotions. And that's one useful way in which you can get at how it is that happiness gets expressed linguistically, not just physiologically, not just facially, not just emotionally, but in terms of how it gets mediated through a culture. It gives you essentially an emotional cross-section of language. And that's largely what my approach, my linguistic and computational approach to the issue of happiness deals with there. So yeah, that's what I do in my interdisciplinary take on happiness.
James, thank you so much. So we've heard from some brilliant approaches here. So I'm just going to encourage our attendees to keep sending in your comments and your questions. We'll put them to our speakers. So I mean, I'll open up, if I may. James, it was really fascinating from your approach, and something that we heard Amelia talk about was this tension often between empiricism and empirical data and perhaps the interior notions of happiness. So from your perspective, I would love to get a sense of, from your, what feels like quite a quantitative approach, what's been the biggest obstacle or barrier from your discipline to be interdisciplinarian? I'd love to get a sense from that from every one of our speakers, just to try and tease out the day-to-day challenges for you as interdisciplinary thinkers and the challenges you have to transcend beyond what academia may have boxed you in individually as. James, may I start with you?
Speaking from a linguistics perspective, linguistics is an interesting discipline because it's inherently interdisciplinary, because there's formal linguistics, which takes in mathematics and takes in quantitative modeling, but then there's also historical linguistics, which is to do with tracing change across time. And then within linguistics, you have interpretive linguistics and you have cognitive metaphor theory, which looks at interpreting symbols. And what emerges there, I think, is the kind of fundamental challenge is what C.P. Snow once called the two cultures, which is that you have a culture of kind of quantitative reasoning and a culture of kind of qualitative reasoning. And the two sometimes kind of mismatch, not necessarily because they're intellectually inconsistent, but because often the different kind of skill sets that each of those align with tend to kind of have kind of draw social boundaries as well too. And those social boundaries, I think, can be problematic sometimes. The idea that I do interpretive work, I do qualitative work versus I do quantitative work. And when you have a group identity aligning with an intellectual position, it can, I think, exaggerate differences that may not actually be there in practice, but which nevertheless people say, Quant is different from Qual and I'm Qual, or vice versa. So I think that is the fundamental problem in linguistics, at least when it comes to being interdisciplinary.
James, thank you. And Amelia, I'd love to get your take on what James has said and also share your own perspectives of the challenges that you've faced in perhaps trying to reconcile the reality of a system in which it operates in a very particular way versus trying to promote this interdisciplinary approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think what James has said is so relevant, and people outside universities maybe sort of, it's weird to think about how serious this sort of quant-qual divide can become, particularly in the social sciences and then the policy fields that kind of build on that narrow set of disciplines. And this, I think, is where there's a really huge opportunity for interdisciplinarity, because once one goes beyond the social sciences, actually some of that starts to break down, because the idea that there are just these sort of two ways of thinking becomes ridiculous when you look at all the different ways of reasoning that exist within the sciences more broadly and within the humanities and the arts. And so I think that's one big opportunity there. And the other is really trying to think about kind of what data is, what it can be, how we collect it, how we make sense of it. Those skills are common across what we would think of as kind of quantitative and qualitative methods. And so I think that's been, one of the challenges in my work and in my field has been kind of trying to always move beyond the established idea of like, what are the methods that we have and how do we apply those to answer the questions that we have, to a more fluid way of thinking about, how can we really reason with data and sort of do that in ways that aren't necessarily bound by just sort of, okay, well, this is the method that we use to answer this kind of question.
Thank you. And Mattia, I'll come to you. And we have a question from Liz, who wants to know, given that philosophy is a study or theoretical basis of a particular branch of knowledge or experience, it should be a core or fundamental discipline at every level of education. Do you think if it was, it would help with interdisciplinarity?
Well, Liz, thanks on behalf of all philosophers and philosophers for this very flattering comment. Let me just say, I do believe that, I've always actually believed strongly that philosophy is interdisciplinary. So the interesting question is, what is so interdisciplinary about philosophy? And I guess here's an attempt to answer the question. When you learn philosophy, you learn a set of skills, a method really, that can be applied to all forms of knowledge. And they're precisely the alleged distinction, divide between qual and quant that James mentioned, that really falls down, because all those skills that you learn when you philosophize, or you learn to philosophize, can be applied to, again, all forms of knowledge. I always tell my students, trying to define philosophy is a bit of a mission impossible. However, I use a metaphor, and I always say, think of a philosopher a bit like a surgeon. A surgeon is someone who needs to know pretty much everything about anatomy and the human body, but the surgeon is also someone who needs to master, to acquire and master specific skills in order to perform surgery. The philosopher does a bit like the same. The philosopher needs to know all the theories and the ideas that, of course, constitute that body of knowledge, but the philosopher also needs to know exactly, to acquire, to master those skills in order to be able to write and think about those ideas. So there is a know what and there is a know how. The know how of philosophy is highly interdisciplinary, and that's really the core of our interdisciplinarity in philosophy.
Mattia, thank you. And Carl, I want to give you the opportunity to come in and maybe respond to Liz's question, or the earlier question, which was around the personal. I'd love to get a sense from yourself, having spent a lot of time in this space and having co-founded the school, of course, what you see to be the biggest tensions in reality that are preventing an interdisciplinarity both within academia and wider society.
So much to say, Nizam. I'll try to be brief. So just to support Mattia, I agree with what he said. Interestingly, Bertrand Russell said all those years ago that philosophy tends to rear its head in times of great crisis and change. When things are bumbling along and people aren't really worried about the big questions, nobody really cares about philosophy because things are self-evident. And that's not the case, I think, in the world today. So it's not surprising that we are seeking philosophy and new ways of doing philosophy. And I think that's very important. So I'm very sympathetic to a lot of philosophy and what we do. I think on the Quant and Qual, Amelia's already characterized it brilliantly, but you can't really overemphasize, I think, the kind of intellectual battles going on here. And there are very good thinkers on both sides. There's a chap actually at LSE, I think his name is Finelli, who's written a very good paper that essentially all methods are quantitative, because if you're transferring any information at all that has any value, then it's got some informational and therefore quantitative content. That's at least how I understand him. It's quite a technical work, but it's very convincing, at least at face value. And then there are people who say, of course, that everything is some kind of human construct. This is the sort of social constructivism, which has morphed somewhat into postmodernism and critical theory, which dominates the humanities at the moment, who say, all science is basically some sort of human power relation, and therefore it's all kind of subjective. And these really are important positions in the academy, which then impact on research and I think spill out of the academy into government, into policy, into media, into culture wars. So I think, people shouldn't underestimate how a lot of university life is upstream of what happens to the society and in the longer run. And these kinds of things about Quant versus Qual are extremely important in that discussion. So LIS, we are wrestling this. We want to form a constructive hybrid of these ways of seeing the world, and of course have some kind of positive impact which acknowledges all the different positions and the strength of them, but doesn't kind of put ourselves at one pole or another. I guess that is actually important, and something that we stand for positively is this sort of collective intelligence that Mattia said, that in some kind of almost maximally hybrid understanding of the world amongst all of us, we will reach a better position than inhabiting one kind of extreme pole or another within it. If I could just make one more point, and I'm sort of slightly positioning myself as the kind of interrogator of interdisciplinarity. I hope that comes across as healthy. I do think it's healthy that I almost doubt what we do all the time. I think that will lead us to better, more rigorous results. But I think you've seen almost from this discussion, and Alex's question might be relevant to that in a way, that interdisciplinarity is fantastic on analysis, but it still has a real problem of what to act and what to do, right? And that's better than not having an analysis. It's a little bit back to my necessary and sufficient conditions at the beginning, because if you just take a punt without any analysis, you're probably more likely to make the wrong punt. But interdisciplinarity still has to work out when it has enough sufficient perspectives, when it's gone deep enough into this kind of multi-dimensional analysis of the problem, when the collective intelligence is strong enough, it's not just going to work out when to jump, how to act. And I think that is a big challenge for interdisciplinary workers, because I hope you're seeing this very beguiling to have infinite perspectives on the problem. Everything seems right. It enriches one's understanding, and it's all very good. But we still have to kind of make a decision how to act, when to act with that enhanced knowledge.
And Carl, it's a perfect pivot, as you say, because I think we're painting a picture of collective intelligence. I think, as you and Mattia have said, and anybody who works in any kind of high-level decision-making process realizes at the end of the day, some conviction of decision making is required. And Alex, to that extent, has asked a really great question. If I could encourage our listeners to continue sending in your thoughts, your comments, and your questions, we'd love to put them to our speakers. If we have such a limited understanding of happiness, does that mean our policies, which are based on this limited understanding, are likely to be based on false or erroneous assumptions and will therefore have the wrong impact? And I'd like to add to that and put it to the other way, which is, if we had too much information, will we ever make a decision knowing fully well the nuances of every single permutation of that decision-making process? So I'll come to Mattia first, if I may, because you're smiling.
Thanks, Nizam. That's another great question. I do believe that there is something I want to say about interdisciplinarity, and it's something that I've shared with my colleagues quite a few times. One very good thing about interdisciplinarity is serendipity. It's serendipitous nature, in the sense that, as I said before, when you bring things together, the combination creates something unexpected, something unplanned. That could be surprising, it could be different, and it could be something, as I said, you don't know exactly what will come out of it. This might actually be a problem, especially in policymaking, because when it comes to policymaking, you want to have, Amelia will for surely add something to this, you want to have a clear plan of action, you want to implement it, you want to know exactly what the end point will be, especially in social policy. And so you see, there's a tension here between the benefits, the necessity of interdisciplinarity in theory and in practice, and yet the serendipitous nature of the phenomenon, which is extremely fascinating and yet a bit dangerous, something we have to be conscious of. I'm sure Amelia will follow up on this.
Amelia.
Yeah, I think, there's two things here. I want to go to Alex's question of this, but just on that question of, can you have information become sort of paralyzing? And I think one of the things we maybe have to break away from is that idea of sort of single one-shot decisions, and sort of, that there is kind of one linear process. And this is really hard, like this absolutely feel this tension as well. It draws a lot on different disciplines, and so shares a lot with interdisciplinarity. Is all about sort of being able to iterate, to learn a bit, to change, to shift, and that doesn't sit well with our kind of established ways of doing things. We like to plan and then implement, and those kind of two separate stages. So I think part of what interdisciplinarity has to achieve, it kind of becomes more widespread as a way of doing things, not just a way of learning or studying, is to help us create systems that are more capable of things like iteration, that are more capable of seeing not plan and implementation stage that we kind of impose on the world, but that we're all operating within complex systems, and how do we create more connections, create more feedback loops to be able to kind of act in a more responsive way, rather than in that kind of old way of planning and implementing. So I think that's the first thing. How we do want to fully benefit from this approach. On Alex's question specifically, just to say, I think the problem at the moment is not so much that the risk that policies based on a limited understanding of happiness would have the wrong impact, but that we're not basing policies on the understanding of happiness that we have. We have it, it's there, but it's not sort of accepted enough, it's not strong enough, because I think we have really interrogated all the complexities of what it actually is, for it to have real traction. So we don't have, happiness-based policymaking, and we'd have to kind of get to a better understanding of it, I think, before we could have that.
Amelia, thank you. And I know we have nations around the world who now have ministers for happiness, for example, which is in itself fascinating. And does the cart come before the horse? You just need to commit to it and then allow the thinking to follow behind instead of having the thinking first. James, Alex's question, and maybe a question around how do you get to a place where you can effectively ensure the full benefits of interdisciplinary thinking is something that can be done, especially in a context of Alex's question, where limited understanding might have limited less consequences, but not the maximal impact of where a policy area could be going.
Sure. I mean, there's an old saying that every model is wrong, and it's not a question of the model being right, it's a question of it being useful. And in that sense, all of our policy decisions are going to be incomplete until that distant day when all of our knowledge integrates into one coherent whole, which of course, I'm sure will be next year, but maybe not. And in that context, we need to make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. And until we're able to deal with those conditions of uncertainty in a way that quantifies our uncertainty, or at least manages it, then we're never going to make a decision ever. And I think several people have alluded to that point already. The second point I would say, and this may be relevant to the question of where interdisciplinarity might help us with this, is I'm not altogether convinced that the reasons we take on the policies that we do are the reasons that we say we take on the policies that we do. And often the time is, at least at a political level, people adopt policies because they satisfy the preferences of someone, and the preferences aren't to make things run efficiently and coherently and practically. It's because those preferences are emotional or sometimes irrational, or to do with any number of concerns which aren't to do with the policy being effective. They're to do with the policy being seen to be adopted. And I think one interdisciplinary perspective there would simply be the anthropology of human relations, which allows us to see these kind of decisions, not in terms of whether they work or whether they don't, but in terms of whether their stated purpose aligns with their actual purpose when you dig beneath that. And in that sense, you can use anthropology, as a corrective to policy analysis, or policy analysis as a corrective to anthropology, in those various different ways. So that would be my sense, but of course, they're just two examples, and there's many more you can multiply. I would say more generally, I see the value of interdisciplinarity, and Carl has alluded to this, as error reduction. It's not so much that you're going to be right, it's just that you can avoid obvious ways of being wrong. And one way to avoid the obvious ways of being wrong is to look at the obvious mistakes that are picked out as first principles to avoid by every other discipline that you can lay your hands on. So I think in that sense, it's not a question of being right, it's just a question of being kind of less wrong.
James, thank you. And Carl, I was going to invite you to come in and offer your thoughts on the conversation so far on this question.
I see a lot of synergy, unsurprisingly and encouragingly, between what all my colleagues are saying, but that thing about being less wrong ties in also with Amelia's thing about us learning to iterate, not seek endpoints in implementation. It's all part of the same piece, really, and the same kind of worldview about how we think about ourselves embedded in these complex real world problems. And there's another concept here, which is a kind of, in some ways, a baby concept, in some ways, a very zeitgeisty concept, which is the concept of emergence. That from complex, and it's relevant, I think, to Mattia may correct me, but to collective intelligence as well, that there are, and at different scales and to do with different interactions and in different systems, there are properties that emerge from systems that you cannot predict in advance. And we just are not very comfortable with this as a species, or as communities, or as academic institutions, or anything really, because we can't really predict that measurable endpoint. We know now these emergent properties exist in all manner of systems, from traffic jams to ant colonies to the human brain, and yet we are very uncomfortable with setting up, particularly actually education systems, and I imagine also policy systems, where output and learning outcomes predicted and sold and told in advance are kind of required by our democratic structures. But I think we have to get more comfortable with this, as Amelia's intimated. For me, it's in education, we have to get more comfortable with it. We have to allow that if we set up the culture and the processes and the curriculum and the pedagogy correctly, there will be emergent outcomes which are fantastic. And again, as James has said, less wrong than others, but very unpredictable in advance. So setting up these social systems so that we get the best chance of the best emergent outcomes is a very big deal. And I think we all need to try and work on that and with that. And interdisciplinarity is kind of embedded in the very heart of that. It's going to be some kind of complex system which requires an interdisciplinary approach, which is going to lead to these emergent outcomes.
Carl, thank you very much. Well, Carl has asked me a question which I'm happy to take. which is, and he puts in quotation marks, as a real world practitioner, and I hope that's more of a, not a questioning my real world practitioner status, but rather emphasizing it. How can these academic ideas be applied on a practical policy level, and what's been my experience? And I want to say a few things, which is, as somebody who tries, and I say tries being the operative word, to adopt a polymathic approach in terms of trying to take very different understandings. So I'll give you an example. So my social integration, social cohesion is something that I have been deeply committed to and interested in the work that I do. And I'll give you 3 things I do within my sphere to address that, and the challenges of all 3. So one, which is through the prism and lens of human rights, which is allowing individuals. So I'm shout out to the organizations I support, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights in the UK, and the incredible work that we do in education around Speak Truth Through Power, trying to promote agency of individuals to understand what we're doing. And then separately, providing young people in particular the ability to express themselves and shift the narratives about them and their communities. And so I support and proud to support a brilliant organization called Ghetto Film School London, which is about giving young people the skills to become trained practitioners in film and industry. And then separately, I support an organization called Belong, which is the Cohesion Integration Network. And what's really interesting to me is it's the same goal that we're trying to pursue, but often structurally in response to Akas, what I find is when you're at the point of fixing a problem, it's very rarely upstream, you're downstream, which means you're fixing the issue once it's already an issue. And a lot of our time in the real world is spent effectively addressing symptoms and not causes. And that, I think, is quite an interesting analogy in terms of the stream that I think most people who work in any kind of consulting will appreciate that we have. So what you then end up having to do is fly the plane whilst refueling it. And by that, I mean, you're flying the plane in terms of you're fixing the problem, you're stopping the bleeding, you're stopping the hemorrhaging, whether it's an issue of helping young people fulfill their potential, whether it's addressing issues of social division in our country. In a COVID context, it literally might be, and that's quite relevant. So for example, if we have a disproportionality of folks dying in the country right now because of their socioeconomic status, which is then amplifying their ethnicity, for example, you have to stop them dying, quite literally. And that's what our government is trying to do. But at the same time, the cause of those aren't anything to do necessarily directly with the genome structure, right? It's because of a social structure historically. And so you have to try and think about the long game around structural problems. But those two often don't fit. And so I want to flip that back onto Carl initially because of your status in terms of this field of how do you fly the plane whilst refueling it here? Because effectively here you are with a brilliant, hopefully, group of graduates that are going to come through LIS who are going to go and be able to fix things. But then at the point of entering LIS, they will have been conditioned not to be thinking in that way, probably. And the vast majority of our education system isn't like that. So what can we do as a collective, both those on this panel, but also those listening, to make sure we are doing both the upstream and downstream work in terms of allowing this approach to flourish?
That's a fantastic question, Nizam. Not one I've actually considered exactly in that form before, teaching young people this idea of if you like, refueling the plane or stitching the wing back on while you're flying, as opposed to thinking where the source is upstream and how we solve it. We as a community, we do think a lot about the problems which we want to address and what sort of problems they are. And that sort of question is almost like a meta question as to what kind of problems we tackle, because I take it that you're so intimating that if you get an articulation of the problem right, you're more likely at the source of the problem and then would not have these refueling problems as you go, if you like. So to that extent, we as an institution think about that. But it's another thing, I think, to ask the question, as you've done rightly, to think how we make young people aware of that issue. And you know, we are already giving our young people, I think, an extraordinarily challenging and different and transformational sort of education. But you know, there will be some kind of limits on their experience as to how real that feels. I mean, when you tell this story, it's alive straight away, and you've lived it, and you can see it. But that is something I think you have to live. We are again working with external organizations on this, so we have lots of external practitioners come in and talk about it. But I would like, and I think my colleagues agree, to move, you know, increasing towards that kind of experiential thing for our students, so that everything they do has some kind of real world skin in the game almost. We've got parts of this in our curriculum, and in the end of the year they do real world projects and so on. But that, as you know, again, is quite difficult in the current education system because of the bureaucratic structures about learning outcomes and outputs and so on, and the need for standardization in many different ways. It's not so easy to throw undergraduates into a situation where they'll really experience it in the way that you've done. So I hope I've answered some of that positively and some of that speculatively, but it's a great question. I actually did want to bring in Amelia, so I'm glad her light is up. That's okay.
Amelia, over to you.
I just wanted to come in because I think this metaphor of the, you know, rebuilding the plane while it's flying is so apt and extends beyond interdisciplinarity, but also to a lot of the challenges that we're facing in education. And it'd be interesting to hear from others how much this feels like just social science education. But I mean, at the moment, so many of the kind of ontological categories, so our ways of understanding the social world, are being questioned quite rightfully because they stem from a history that is, you know, highly gendered, that is one of kind of colonialism, that is one, you know, a lot of the categories that we've sort of inherited are ones that we don't necessarily want to use anymore, or at least that we want to kind of question the ways that they've been used, the things that they're associated with them, and that creates a challenge because, you know, how do we teach, how do we learn, how do we communicate? We can kind of build new ones, but then students are going out into a world that is, in many ways, still sort of beholden to a lot of these old ways of thinking. And I think in relation to interdisciplinarity in particular, sort of a lot of the debates about ways of knowing, about kind of hierarchies of disciplines, about different kind of ways of reasoning, creating knowledge, all of these are questions that we want to grapple with. And yet there's a tension of how do you work with students in new ways, allow them to really kind of explore in those new ways of doing things, while also preparing them for, you know, to be able to communicate and interact and work in, you know, in a world that is still not transformed. So yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels there with what people are grappling with across academia in terms of kind of decolonizing education, but also specifically in interdisciplinarity in terms of we have this opportunity to create different relationships between disciplines, but there are social challenges to that as well as kind of epistemological ones.
Amelia, Carl, thank you. I mean, it's a long conversation, of course. An hour-long discussion here won't do it justice, but I hope it's given those listening a sense and a flavour of the depth of it. And please do keep sending in your questions. And I want to bring it back to the frame in which we are looking, which is, of course, happiness. And Maisie has asked a question, and then it speaks to some of the ontological historical frames that Amelia has just mentioned, with the historical perspective of melancholia being the mark of a bright mind, or the more modern phrase, ignorance is bliss. Should happiness be used as a policy goal? Mattia.
Thanks. That's quite challenging. Thank you, Maisie. All right. So, well, first of all, thanks for the reference to Melancholia, which is one of my interests at the moment. I'd probably be wary of a government which aims to make everybody happy. That would be more of a dystopian fiction. However, I think that happiness, rather than being a policy goal, should be a policy instrument. And so, going back to some of the things that my colleague said, it's very important to consider that happiness is a multidimensional element in itself. And so it has to be taken into account, it has to be factored in measures of policy making in order to make the actions, the policies more richer, more complex, really. Why is it that I'm a bit skeptical on the idea of treating happiness as a policy goal? Because happiness means different things to different people. It also feels different to different people. Here's an example. I'm sure you know, well, you're familiar with the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. You may have seen even Wittgenstein on t-shirts because he has become a bit of an icon. People think that Wittgenstein was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Now, if you look at those arresting images of Wittgenstein, what you see is a tormented, restless genius. Now, just before dying, Wittgenstein is reported to have said, well, I've lived a happy life. You see how relative really the concept of happiness is to people. And that's why I'm so, in a way, I'm a bit skeptical about the idea of treating it as a goal in itself, but yes, an instrument.
Mattia, thank you. And James, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Maisie's questions of should happiness be used as a policy goal?
If I can roll it in together with some of the previous questions, Alex's and Wakas's in particular, I'd like to put the policy goal here as being an educational policy goal. And the question is, should you make your students happy? And if I can narrow it down to that, I might perhaps have something to say about it, because I think it becomes an interesting challenge then, because there's a lot of tension in third level education at the moment as to what students get from their education. If a student is going into debt to be educated, sometimes quite considerably so, then the question is, do you service the students' desires or do you service the students' needs? And desires and needs don't often align very well, as anyone, you know, who's a human being knows. And in that sense, I think one of the challenges faced with kind of making happiness a policy goal in education or elsewhere is whether you should aim for that superficial happiness where somebody feels that they've got what they wanted, but in actual fact may not have gotten what they need. And it's a very difficult path to negotiate, I think, between the two, because often to give somebody what they need, you have to make them unhappy for a little bit. And that can be in an educational context. You put them into a place of anxiety where you confront them with challenging material, where you perhaps push them further than they've been willing to go before. And oftentimes they will come back to you and they will say, yes, that was a transformative experience and I'm very happy that you did that. You know, it was done to me, it's been done to everybody, where somebody just pushed you in the back and, you know, you were the better for it. But also it can happen too, that you push someone too far and they come back and say that was a disorienting experience, I didn't like it, it made me feel bad about myself and I wish it hadn't happened. And, you know, to go back to Maisie's question, I certainly don't have an answer, but I do think it's an important question as to figuring out what that golden mean is between needs and wants, and figuring out what our policy should address it to in that regard. I probably pitch myself more towards the needs side than the want side, but then everybody thinks that about themselves when it may not be true that they are like that. But yeah, I think it's a crucial question.
And Carl, giving you the chance to come in on Maisie's question specifically about whether happiness should be used as a policy goal.
I'm just a kind of happy boss at the moment. I love listening to my colleagues talk about this thing. So I feel I learn a lot, but I also feel we're very well aligned in the wants, needs distinction which James has just made. And I don't think he knows that I make it all the time when talking about education, younger people in particular. You know, the wants is often, you know, what I know, what I'm safe with, what will give me a good result, what my parents think is appropriate. And the needs, and I think we can say this as educators, I think we should say as educators, the needs are very different. The modern world has changed for many of the reasons that Amelia has said and Mattia has said and so on, and the needs are not often what students think they are. So, you know, it's a really interesting dynamic in welcoming students to the space where we really genuinely mean the best for them. But then there becomes this slight element of paternalism, which I think none of us are terribly comfortable with, which is saying, you know, actually, guys, you need this and you don't really want what you think you want. And these are tremendous challenges. But as I said right at the top of this talk, you know, why would you really be in education unless you wanted to take on these big challenges and these kind of meta challenges? I don't think any of us in the game to make this easy for ourselves or for, this is a needs wants thing too as well, right? We're not doing what we want in a way or what the students want, we're doing what we think is needed and what we think the students also need. And we have to continually be honest about that and reassess that and have a narrative and arguments and the logic and the sort of things that Mattia's mentioned behind the philosophy of what we're doing, but I think that that's where we are. And so that distinction is very helpful to me in terms of an educational debate.
And thank you, Carl. And just to, I mean, I think the wants and needs piece is absolutely fascinating. And I think right at the beginning of this session, I mentioned the COVID context, and one thing that springs to mind at the moment about we're shifting or trying to shift behaviors of individuals around behavior around COVID and how we respond to our most vulnerable communities. And this wants and needs conversation is happening in every quarter of the decision-making process. Just to give everybody an insight into a conversation around, I have friends who are like, why don't we just get more police to effectively allow, punitive measures to stop people from doing different things? And then, you responded with the alarming question of, well, if we do that, you in the long run lose trust in police. In terms of the wants and needs. So absolutely fascinating. I want to give everybody an opportunity. We're very, very close to coming up to an end here. So the session is entitled The Power of Interdisciplinarity. So I want to give everyone a last opportunity to almost pitch for why interdisciplinary thinking. It's really difficult. It's really hard. I just want an easy life. And then secondly, why LIS? So Carl, I want to come to you last, if I may. So if I can start perhaps with Amelia.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, we've been working together on and off. I'm not even full time with them yet for just under a year, and in that time have been exposed to so many more ideas, perspectives that are useful to my thinking about the problems that I've been working on for ages in terms of education ones, than I had in the 10 years before that, when I was at some of the world's kind of top institutions, if you believe those rankings. So I think that's that power that literally just comes from having people in the same place, being able to have real exchange. I just wanted to pick up on the comment that's come in from Karen about maybe happiness facilitates community and by consequence an exchange of ideas, and that's a kind of form of collective intelligence. For me, I think that the exchange of ideas that hopefully then lead to something, so not just getting stuck in a paralysis of sort of circling things, but when people can actually work on something and build something through interdisciplinarity, I think that's what we're trying to do at LIS. And so as far as I know, that's one of the only places really trying to do that at the moment. So that's why interdisciplinarity and why LIS.
Very compelling. I'm certainly convinced. Mattia?
Interdisciplinarity has been around for a very long time. Actually, I'm one of those people who believe that there is something about human nature that goes very well with interdisciplinarity and vice versa, as a kind of trait really of how the mind works. However, over the last, shall we say 20 years, interdisciplinarity has been on the rise. I also think that the word wasn't ready for interdisciplinarity before, but now is, because there is a strong appetite for new categories of thought and action, for new forms of community, precisely. So I want to use a strong word to define the necessity of interdisciplinarity: transformational. Interdisciplinarity is transformational when it comes to thinking and acting. And that's why we are offering a transformational degree to some extent, educational experience. That's the goal.
Thank you, Mattia. James?
John Maynard Keynes once said that if you stay in a closed room for long enough, you can come to believe literally anything. And I think you can kind of view disciplines as closed rooms in that regard, where if you're circling around the echo chamber forever and you're hearing the echo of your voice and your voice being echoed by other people and then the echoes of their voice, you end up just repeating the same thing in a slightly different way over and over again. And I think interdisciplinarity is one of the few keys out of that echo chamber, where you stop hearing yourself talking back to yourself. And that, for me at least, is one of the most compelling reasons why I think it's such an amazing intellectual project. As for LIS and why I would advocate LIS, I do think that there's an optimal size for an organization that's somewhere between a conspiracy and a corporation. And we're there now, yeah. So if you want to get that, you have that perfect size where ideas percolate enough that they get the edges knocked off them, but also it's small enough that they circulate fast. And that there is that collegiality there, which gives it an emphasis. Now, when we become as big as Cambridge or Harvard or whatever, I say go somewhere else, yeah. But we're not that yet. And I would say now is the time. Now is the sweet spot to go to LIS, right? Where we're the optimal size for making interdisciplinarity happen.
I really hope your marketing team are paying attention, because some nuggets here that should be on your website. And last but by no means least, Carl.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we've talked a lot about the sort of instrumental potential for interdisciplinarity, and I hope that's been evident in the analysis of happiness that we've given from these perspectives and the recognition of the challenges. But I think these last two comments from Mattia and James about the sort of humanness of interdisciplinarity and its inherent connection with learning and personal growth. I mean, that is also what education is about, right? And that's really what life is about, I think. I know there are people who don't believe that, but I struggle when someone says, I never want to learn anything ever again. It's like, I don't get it. That's almost death, right? So, I mean, I hope that's been evident from this discussion that there is something just so deeply connected between interdisciplinarity and learning for learning's sake, expanding one's mind, the life of the mind, these lovely old phrases, which, you know, should still be a part of that unique experience, which is higher education. So I hope I'll end on that note rather than the more interesting discussion of instrumentality we've had earlier.
And can I just say, I mean, a huge thank you to Mattia, James, Amelia, Carl for such an enriching conversation. I genuinely feel far more informed already and excited actually for the school. And probably as a practitioner, what's really exciting about that last component of this conversation, it really speaks to what I know for sure is the case when we talk about social cohesion, where you have isolated communities and we live in a world that's divided, and we see this in America, of course, at the moment. And the single best thing you can do is not go and tell somebody they're wrong, rather open up a space where everybody can bring themselves. And actually what you're trying to articulate is a space where people can reconcile difference as opposed to contest ideas dogmatically. So a couple of things I just want to really share that I've really took away from this conversation, which has been incredibly enriching. I mean, that idea of collective intelligence being less wrong, I love that. I think it's so key. You know, we're not trying to boil the ocean, as they say. Amelia talking about, you know, the fact that there are ongoing conversations. I'm attached to a university not too far away from you, SOAS, which is really looking at decolonizing the curriculum. And so actually the ability to review the very ontological frameworks that we know to be disciplines, you can't do that without an interdisciplinary approach. So I absolutely think that's essential. The work I've done with young people, you learn really quickly, you know, the wants and needs. Effectively, you know, sometimes what somebody needs isn't what they want. And of course that makes total sense, but the practicality of that is incredible and transformational. And I absolutely love, and I think this may be one of my favorite things to take away, an optimal size is between a conspiracy and a corporation. I think that's absolutely fantastic. So the LIS is running a short navigating happiness course. So please do sign up by this Friday if you want to really bring this to life a bit more. Thank you to everybody that's taken part and listened, and to those who will be listening later on as this goes online. This festival has been curated by the DaVinci Network. Please do support them. They've launched a Kickstarter campaign to really try and encourage the notion of polymathic thinking and interdisciplinarity. And of course, the festival goes on for another a week and a half. So please do participate. Thank you again so much for participating, and we wish you all a wonderful evening. Take care.